Let's turn immediately to your questions, and starting perhaps here in the Opera House without any kind of pump priming from me. I just don't think it's necessary at all. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Jay Kilborn from Kennebunk. Is there a practical opportunity to address desertification and actually affect the climate and improve the food and fiber situation through permaculture and reforestation and employment?
That's for you.
Yeah, there is, because we have, for over 42 years, we have a lot of science and a lot of technologies and techniques. And what it's left behind the slides is that we actually took a piece of land, degraded, and with a little bit of design, the Zai, the Half Moon, the Le Cordon Pierreux, we actually significantly retain water and then increase the production capability of the land. So what is actually, we didn't get a chance to go through this because those experiences, if you scale them up and out, you're going to be greening or regreening a lot of different places. And all of a sudden, when you do that, and I've seen it with my eyes in Chad when we did that, we retained the water from the rainy season, and then we went into the second production cycle, and all of a sudden you sit there with respect to diversifying the fauna and the flora. You have butterflies, and you have small rabbits, and you have onion growing, and all of a sudden you see green, you smell fresh air, and then small trees become. So the ecosystem actually start popping up, and if you create those opportunities throughout at least the 13 countries, you're going to be able to reverse the system. Now, that's why we're saying, if in areas where it's too dry, then with this World Bank project, and then we're going to actually create opportunities for a lot of other donors to come in. When you irrigate, we're going to be irrigating about 600,000 hectares in about 5 years. I should be able to, yeah, I understand. Don't get too excited about how about erosion, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we're looking into all of that. But we will be able to reverse it. In fact, we have shown that you reclaim a piece of land, you will reclaim 1 hectare, and then we came in and then we showed folks what to do. And then we did the analysis, and the data did indeed show that we produce 1.5 more than if we were to produce without reclaiming it. And I think you go to Niger, you're going to see 14 million hectares already reclaimed. And when you do use the agroforestry concept of getting the trees to drop their leaves and then increase the organic matter content of the soil, and all of a sudden you have really beautiful ecosystem that will be able to sustain livelihood.
Thanks. Another question back here. Yes, ma'am.
Sally Smith from Maine. When Juma was here 2 years ago, one of the points that he made was that until the African countries can develop their infrastructure, their roads, bridges, railroads, whatever, and get those agricultural products that your reclaimed land will produce to market, that reclaimed land and the productivity that it can generate will never really work. Is there any motion in the direction of developing that kind of infrastructure so that the reclaimed land and the productivity that it produces will sustain it? I mean, will develop.
Yeah. Right now, excuse me, SILS has a market unit. Actually, in countries, you go from point A to point B, and you have roadblocks, maybe 15 of them. Every imaginable thug sits there and asks you to pay something, do something. So SILS, what we do is we do the analysis along the big roads from Kano to Lagos, from Lome and so on, and went to Ghana, went to Ivory Coast, and we analyzed this. We came up and we had we get big meetings where about 100 people take place, all from all walks of life. And we show them, these are the data, corruption and kickbacks and bribery and what have you. And if you do that, then the flow of goods and services is going to be impeded. And so presidential decrees actually did take place. So when you go from point A to B, instead of going through 8 checkpoints, now you have no checkpoints. And that all of a sudden, actually, looking at it from the back end to come back to the front end, it will stimulate the opportunities for private sector to come and invest, to say, oh, I'm not going to be hindered along this corridor because I can either produce fresh goods. Yeah, naturally, infrastructure is a part of the African Development Bank project, so we're going to build feeder roads and what have you. But the main issues is how can you cross from one country to another without necessarily going through a bunch of headaches. And the work we've been doing so far has been really remarkable.
Thanks, Jim. I'm told that we have a question from one of our... This again for Dr. Adoum, I think.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry, from Movember, of course, yeah. How did your service as a U.S. Marine affect your views on African security and terrorism? This is Andy Cadeau in Portland.
Well, military service teaches you a certain basis of analysis, right, and leadership. So as you look at any security situation, those are the elements that inform your judgment on that. So the U.S. military is led by civilians. Yeah, you learn that very quickly, that your weapon is provided by the lowest bidders, which is not always a good thing, but is what the civilians decided because that's what the purse can afford. When you look at the various situations, then you also can follow the money in that situation and to see how things are run over there. You quickly learn that in many other countries, at least in Africa, in most countries, militaries are not run by civilians. Yeah, it's run by other military people in civilian clothes, which actually quickly lead us to the situation we have in most of the continent. The African continent has about four types of militaries. Right? You have the Republican professional adequate army, and that's a rare breed. That's an army that stands for the Republic in the way that we do in the US. They serve the people, they take orders from the Congress, the Parliament, and they're not caught in the politics of the place. This is the case of Senegal, Tanzania, Ghana. It's very short, eh? Ghana and South Africa. That's about it, pretty much as a Republican army. The other armies you have in Africa, which is a big bulk in the middle there, it's former militia. So those are what I call non-professional, non-Republican, adequate armies, right? These armies are typically old militias or rebel movement that came to power and then became the national armies of their countries. These countries do not serve the republic. They serve the old militia leader who became president. They serve the region for which they were fighting when they were in the bush, right? This would be the NRM for Uganda. It would be Chad. The case in Rwanda. There's a few lists like that along the way. And then you have countries that used to have armies that worked and no longer do, but they have a mismatch of militias, former militias. They have parallel chains of command. They don't invest in any training in any substantial way. And this will be the DRCs of the world, the Burundi, and a few others. And then you have some other armies in between there. We don't know what they do, but they're armies. So they have planes, they have all kind of things. So this way Kenya will have fit, right? So Kenya looked very good on paper, fantastic military. We invested a lot of money until 7 terrorists showed up at a mall, right? And then the entire military structure was exposed for what it was. You know, they couldn't get the terrorists out. And not only they couldn't get out, then they looted the mall. So you get a sense. So this is what military training, from my experience here, taught me in looking at some of those places. Thanks. Nigeria is a crazy case, as is often the time. So they used to have a very strong military, and then they decided, I used to think it was a Republican army for a while, until Boko Haram showed up. because that's the test of a military. You know, Malawi looks good on paper. So does Zimbabwe, so does Angola, actually so does Namibia. But unless you put them in combat or in a situation where they have to perform, that's how you know a good doctor. Tell him to do the surgery, right? And then you see what happens. For military, it's the same way. Put them in the zone. So Nigeria went through a series of coups. While they had all the good structure, they were not training properly. Soldiers were not shooting live rounds in Nigeria. So by the time Boko Haram came, that was the first time some of the Nigerian soldiers were hearing real gunfire. So it exposed the weakness of the Nigerian army. This was the civilian being afraid of coups and then gutting the military. So now I don't know where Nigeria falls. I think it falls with the rest of the continent.
Kai, did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about, governance on both of those questions. The one question about infrastructure. So, when you look at SILS, you would be amazed on the African continent at the number of organizations with extremely qualified people who have the solutions to our problems. Our problem is not so much having the brain power to solve these problems. As you have an organization for SILS, if you go to maritime issues, you will find an organization. If you go to forests, you will find organizations. If you go to agriculture, with very highly qualified people who have the solutions. And the problem always boils down to the politics. The roadblocks that Jimmy was mentioning. So to go to Jimmy's country, I was laughing because this is Central Africa, sitting up here, Chad, Congo, and Cameroon. We are the last bastion of the dictators. Yeah, once we fix that, we're done. But Chad, to go to his country, most of the traffic goes through my country, port of Douala, and then goes up. And studies showed that Chadian truckers had 70 roadblocks between Douala and N'Djamena. We have all the studies, we have all the elements. Do you think Biya cares? He does not care. It's very difficult to get your head around this, but these are rulers who have one objective, very clear objective: stay in power. They have no other objective. Anything else you're doing is secondary. Okay, these people are grumbling over here. Okay, give them a little crumb. Do something, but get out of my way. That's not their primary objective. And Chad took their business away. Idris Deby decided he was going to go through Benin, go through Nigeria, and go to Chad. Much longer route, but cheaper finally, because there were not the 70 roadblocks. Do you think somebody in Cameroon cared? So for any other country, you'd be going, oh, our customs fees, we're losing business and so on. It's not the way that these countries work, unfortunately. And I wanted to add something about our militaries. So Cameroon has a very interesting mix because we have a military that looks Republican, very well trained, very professional. But once again, until Boko Haram came, the only thing that most militaries in Africa have ever done, their enemy, has been the people. The only people they've ever gone up against is their own citizens. So every time you see them act up against an actual enemy that also has guns and can shoot back, they generally fall apart. And this is what we saw with, imagine, and in some of these questions we talk about, the US wants to help us and so on and so forth. Come on, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, we cannot pay our own bill. We are all oil-producing countries, rich with minerals, so you wouldn't know what to do with them. But we spend that money. The Nigerians were so corrupt. If we have to take these people to court, The number of lives that were lost in the first few months of Boko Haram in 2014 were lost just because we had dysfunctional, corrupt generals. They were putting the money in their pockets and sending the soldiers to the front with flip-flops on. Seriously. Kids, they were sending these kids to the front without the proper equipment, without the proper, so you know, it always, we don't have a technical problem in Africa. We really don't. It's not that we don't know the solutions, we have, it always boils down to this issue of governance.
I just add something quickly.
Of course.
A couple other things is also the culture of the various militaries in Africa. It's a culture whereby, you know, in a professional army, like in the professional military in the US, your performance is key. You get evaluated every quarter. You have what they call pros and cons. You know where you stand. If you're good, you move forward. If you're bad, you get out of the way. You know, for officers, after 4 years, you make captain. After that, they reevaluate. Do you continue or you get out? In a lot of those countries, the evaluation is not set, which means you find somebody who's been a captain for 30 years.
Yes.
Right? It should be either retiring or something, but they don't promote him. So it's just there because they need the number. There's also a culture that says, do not do well. Because if you perform your job well, you're accelerating and hastening your own demise, right? Literally, sometimes figuratively. And then there's a lack of capacity across the militaries on the continent. So every time you have a new initiative, AMISOM, ECOWAS in the old days of Liberia and Sierra Leone, where Nigeria, by the way, showed great leadership. But they always need the US Air Force to come and airlift them. This goes to what Kai is saying. Really, African country cannot cobble together an entire squadron, an escadron of C-130s, 3 from Uganda, 4 from Nigeria, a couple from Morocco, and shadow your own people. But you have to get people from Colorado, from Delaware, to fly over there through AFRICOM, send them, take them to Somalia. What kind of joke is that?
AFRICOM, the 4-star American military command created just a few years ago to deal with problems in Africa. Yes, 2.
Charlie Graham from Camden. From many of the speakers, we've been hearing something about NGOs in Africa. We in the United States are constantly hearing about the good works NGOs do, and we're often asked to contribute to them. And I heard a talk the other day about the performance of NGOs in the Congo, where, of course, I guess it's maximum government dysfunction. And it sounded as though the NGOs were more of a menace than a help. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the performance of NGOs. Thank you.
Who wants to take that? It's a great question.
Well, first of all, you have to salute people's contribution. You know, I talk about humanity of people. You know, people care. This country is one of the most generous countries in the world. Not necessarily the government, but the people. The American people are among the most generous people in the world. Don't force them to do it. Tell them what you need. They will help. But the challenge becomes that, not all NGOs are not created equal. So I don't want to say everybody is doing wrong or right. But there is an aggregate evaluation. And that aggregate evaluation is problematic because NGOs are designed from this perspective, this side of the Atlantic, right? So you have a little fund from your retirement, you want to do good. So you watch 60 Minutes, you saw a specific case, poor girl struggling in XYZ mountain over there, and you say, I need to do something about this. You come across a neighbor who's been working in Angola for a few years, you say, I really need to do this. So you are determining already what needs to be happening over there. You give your money, the NGO takes the money over there to do what you have decided you want to do. You know, most people that have money, that's what they do. They ask you to invest this money in specific program. As an NGO manager, you're worried about survival. And your survival is not always dependent on what the people in Eastern Congo want. It's more dependent on what your donors want. Right? So it doesn't matter if what you're trying to do is really the most pressing need of the people in the village you're trying to help. But this is what John Smith or whatever needs you to do. So you're starting forcing the issue. This is part of where the things start becoming a problem. But also NGOs don't always do a good work in advocacy. Yeah? NGOs a lot of the times function like, I call this the funeral parlor model. Right? So when you run a funeral parlor, God bless you, because we all need to be buried sometime or cremated. But you don't pray for death. You pray for business. You don't ask for people to die. That will not be human. No. That's what your church teaches you. So you just pay your tithing and you hope for business. Really means bodies.
I also want to comment, Jimmy.
So that's the challenge. You know, they want to do things, but there's a perversiveness about it.
Yeah.
If your NGO works in one of the SEALS countries, just when they submit the final report, the annual report, have them stamped by SEALs. That will guarantee that they have done business that takes care of the problems, not just fabricated stuff.
Yeah, I think probably just to broaden what Jimmy is saying is that the most effective NGOs, our problem is systemic, yeah? So there's a problem that X number of people in XYZ village do not have water, but just collecting, your $5,000 or whatever and building them a well is a very short-term and generally unsustainable solution to the problem. So if you are building the well, but you're also building the capacity of the people, A, to manage that well, B, for them to be able to go to their local government and ask and start understanding the system and understanding why they don't have water, because they pay taxes to that local government. So if your solution has a systemic component to it, probably you are on the right path. If it has a very short-term, immediate solution, which is the much easier thing to do, always much easier to go build the classroom or build the well or whatever, then there's doubts about its capacity for sustainability. The other thing to remember is that in what we call aid, because NGOs get your money, but they also get money from your government and other governments, and what we call aid, I think many of you in this audience probably know that for every $1 of aid, 7 cents comes back to your country. Yeah? So whenever you have these stories, oh, we've given Africa so much money, and grain of salt, 7 cents comes back to your country in the form of salaries.
I mean, 70.
70 cents, sorry. 70 cents. It's 70%. Yeah,
7
sorry.
wouldn't be bad.
Yeah. Yeah, 7 would be great. 7 would be great. It's 70 cents. So it's 70% of aid comes back to the donor country in the form of salaries. NGO people get nice salaries in many cases. It's the smaller NGOs who don't, but the bigger ones do. They drive nice cars, SUVs and so on. They live in nice villas and so on and so forth. So there's all of that. And then in many, many countries, up to now, any big major equipment has to be bought from your country. Yeah. So you cannot buy the cheaper Japanese car on site with money from American aid. Yeah, which, it makes economic sense, but that's the reality of it. So do keep that in mind, and I think all we're saying with NGOs is that it's a very mixed bag. If you want to to give money, if you want to support, do your homework.
Great. Back in the balcony. With three.
Hi, I'm Dylan Murray from the University of Maine in Orono. I have a food production question. During the 27th Camden Conference, Kalestis Juma spoke about the opportunities in GMOs in food production for Africa. I'm wondering if you share his optimism in GMOs. It's a very controversial topic in the United States, so I was wondering your opinions. Thank you.
It's a great question. Dr. Ed
You can start.
I won't say much of anything about Frankenfood. Here, I'm eating Frankenfood. But here, the debate is rich. There's a legal framework, policy framework. There's a dialogue. And people sort of, each one of us get up and then defend a position and so on. So actually, the USG plus Congress and the universities, everybody's in the debate and trying to sort it out. And there's a lot of opportunities to apply pressure on those who are designing Franken stuff. In Africa, that debate does not exist.
Yeah.
That legal framework does not exist, or if it does, it's very embryonic. And so at least in the 13 member countries, which I direct, I know there is Franken stuff in there, in some of them. But we have not established a policy yet because we are just about entering into a discussion. We can't ignore it because it's there and it's seeping through here and there. And there's both side of the coin, the good stuff and the bad stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if you have policies and regulations that allow you to actually monitor and track the good stuff that happens, fine, and give it credit. And if there is something that is not so good, then you take care of that. And so for now, the issue is out there, and we have not dealt with it. We're just beginning to do the thinking process. And at this stage of the game, I'm just going to leave it at that. But cotton is being, the GMO cotton is out there and being produced. There's also talk about some maize being tested in a few places. I wouldn't say which, because the people will jump on me.
So I would just say for GMOs, and to go back to an earlier discussion this morning about agriculture as a whole, is that what is clear is that, and Jimmy mentioned it in his, if we continue the way our agriculture has grown, has not been through productivity, but through increasing the amount of land that we exploit. So our productivity is very, very poor on the continent. And that is where the GMO, many agricultural specialists believe that for us to solve our food security problems, we do not have an option but to go to GMOs. But I fully subscribe to what Jimmy has just said, that discussion needs to take place in a certain context on the continent, which it is not. But we must move, as much as I love smallholder farmers, the average surface area that is exploited in Africa is 0.75 hectares. You cannot be economically viable. You just simply cannot. And so we have a serious problem in how do we move our farmers from less than 1 hectare to much more. Already when you're at 2 hectares, and not to talk about 3, your productivity and economic viability vastly increases. So we have serious issues in thinking about and talking about how we solve these agriculture problems. And I do believe in large-scale agriculture. I believe it's a mixture of both. We must, of course, support small-scale farmers, but we've got to go to large-scale mechanized.
The one problem which is key, I think that should go with that, is land property. I mean, property rights.
Right, absolutely.
Land rights. Most African countries, along with failure to deliver services and failure to deliver law, rule of law. Mm-hmm. And the rule of law is not just for corporations. It's about the title to the land you eat.
Absolutely.
And I'm not sure how we can talk so much about GMOs and no GMO when we've not even settled who owns what, who holds what piece of land.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's, we've got a lot of questions. Let's take one from our remote, one of our remote sites, and it is, has the growing role of China in African economics been an impediment to political change. Bob Rackmails in Belfast. China, an impediment to political change. The notion being, I guess, that Chinese aid comes without linkages to democracy and human rights and the rest of it. And so lets governments off the hook when that conditionality isn't present. Who wants to look at that? Dr. Adum.
I mean, some of you up there are probably students.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
they are.
Could you get your hands around some of those issues and really, it's not just case studies. You got to go down to the field. You got to interact with folks who are been fighting this thing for so long, just in terms of production systems, modernizing the systems, what knowledge is available, what is applied, what is not applied, bring it back and enrich the university curricula, enrich the public debate so that the Business Harvard case study actually evolves, gets out of its traditional business model, go into these places, tough issues, bring them back and make them part of your educational system. Come to SILS, you get your plane ticket, and I'll provide you a space. You're going to sit there, and then 2-3 months, and you come back and you write your.
Probably has some takers here, but what about China? Who wants to talk about China? Yeah, sure. November.
What about China?
I think the Chinese foray into Africa presented African leaderships with new opportunities to reset the clock in many ways, having learned what they hopefully learned from the dealing with the West. China coming into the market should have taught them a couple things. They should have, this is where the failure of groups like the AU and regional organization became very apparent. Because the African literally, it's practical in the sense that China is not there as an NGO. China is a state. Ali eloquently lined up some of the incentive that is the micromotives of China and why they're behaving the way they behave. So as African, we should know this. We have degrees from China. We have a lot of students in China. A lot of students in China. So it's not even for those of us who are in the West. We have our colleagues who are in China. They should know how Chinese think. They read Chinese literature.
They speak Chinese.
They speak Chinese. Some of them are making Chinese babies now. So we should be able to advise our own government and say, China wants this. This is where we see we can tap into this. We could have worked as a cartel of African countries in various areas. DRC and Zambia are among the top copper producers in the world. Well, do they have really to embrace the Chinese model fully? They could have turned to Chile and Peru and say, look, we need help here because we know the Chinese are coming for you as well. Can we work together in getting more out of these deals? They did not do that, right? So that China, in many ways, bullied its way around. I think it's a missed opportunity, not so much that China is impeding on the growth of the Africans, but the Africans miss another opportunities for the reason that we've all mentioned today and yesterday, to seize on the moment. That's how I see it. So it's not the Chinese missing Africa, it's the Africans missing the boat.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting the way we frame, even the way the question is framed. It's like, come on, guys, we're not babies. We are not, we're not somehow semi-developed human beings where things are always happening to us. We were colonized. You know what? Colonization could not have happened without cooperation from a certain number of Africans, okay? The Chinese have come in and they're doing, not very good business with us. That could not have happened without the cooperation of our leaders, okay? So the reality is that we have encounters with the rest of the world. And the mindset that we need to change in Africa is that you need to go into those encounters with your interests very clear, what you want to get out of that encounter very clear, and your vision of, okay, the only reason to partner with anybody is that somehow you think at the end of that partnership you've grown. And if you haven't figured out what it is, how it is that you want to grow within that partnership, then my statement for, I think, close to 5 years now has always been, it is clear what the Chinese policy for Africa is. What is Africa's policy for China?
But
That is the question.
Very well put. Very well put. Very well.
Thank you for that. Mary Nelson from Falmouth, Maine. I have a question which goes, America is built on a public education system that has been followed by many, many countries. And I would like your comments on the education system and how it can further the interests of all of Africa. What Africa is doing to promote that, to develop it, to develop an understanding of democracy and people's participation in democracy, as well as innovation and new thought and ways in which Africa can develop itself.
Thanks. Who wants to take that one? Dr. Hadoum? Okay.
If someone stays in power for 27 years, and they all said, they mentioned a few people who've been in power for 27 years.
1, 2, 3.
The education.
That's right.
And there are a few of them.
Kabila beat.
Really, there are a few men. And so and those who have stayed in power for 25 and more years, the education system pretty much was shut. Mm-hmm. Because when you are in power for 20 plus years, it's you, your family, your cronies, and the rest. I don't need to go on and on. So kids who go up in that system, who grow up in that system, and who are part of the mix, don't need to learn much of anything. Because they could be poorly educated, but they come back and they get jobs. They have their hands in the jobs, in the public service, in the businesses, and what have you. So consequently, until the whole system goes down the tube, you can name them. There are countries whereby the education system is shut. Countries where actually the alternance, political alternance, happens, then people know they cannot rely on a system more than 10 years. Consequently, they go to school, they learn, so they'll be able to go on the job market and compete. And there are plenty of data that show the extent to which the longer someone is in power, the less likely kids learn. The shorter they are, if they alternate, then folks do indeed learn. Last thing I want to say, there are a bunch of them who say, well, we are going to become emerging in 20 years, in 15 years. And there ain't no emerging out of nothing with this kind of stuff. So, I mean, these guys are more qualified to say, but this is generally speaking what is happening out there.
You know, is it all about governance, education? I mean, is that the...
Well, I think that, I mean, there are some very interesting models happening in Africa. So the thing that gives all of us hope, in spite of the fact that we are facing very squarely the problems of our countries and of our continent, is that at micro levels you see some really extraordinary things happening. Kenya has a program right now, I believe with Google, where they've handed out tablets to X number of students in class and are able to, get those kids connected to technology and learning in a very different manner, and access to information and teaching that they would not normally have where they're situated. So there are things like that happening on a micro level that make you think, aha, if we could get the governance right, or once we get the governance right, we're on the way, then there are already models that we can fall into. But I do want to add on something. You heard me, for me, history is of great importance. If you do not give an African child the identity, the roots that let them know that I am not Technology is not something which is Western.
Absolutely.
Right? There have been African scientists and thinkers, and Timbuktu was one of the first libraries in the world. So if we do not teach our own history, then we produce young men and women who are confused. They have identity confusion. If we don't teach in our history the kind of leadership that African women have shown over the years, then we let that little African girl buy into a narrative that she's hearing that, oh, the poor African woman, oh, this poor woman, and look at her suffering and so on. In my family, I don't know any woman who's like that. Okay?
I can well believe that.
So I think there is work to be done in terms of the curriculum and this is the problem, Chinua Achebe said, the mind of the colonized is a very frightening thing.
Yes, yeah.
Because, to get out of colonization takes so many generations. In many of our schools, we're still teaching the colonizers' history today.
Really?
Yes. We're still teaching the
Nos ancêtres les Gaulois.
So I think there's work to be done in terms of the curriculum for us to own it. I was telling my Ghanaian friends here that I teach leadership, and one of the things I use to teach leadership is Adinkra symbols, which are Ghanaian symbols that teach you about leadership. And once you do that for an African, then leadership is not this American concept that it's like, no, Ghanaians thought about this in the 14th century. So I think that aspect in our education is still, I don't know any country that has really gone and done the work where that is concerned.
Let's go quickly to a remote side. I think we've got a question from there. Are there feminist movements in Africa?
What a question.
Adam Ewing, Rockland. Is there life in Africa?
Yeah,
Right.
basically. So yes.
You want to leave it at that, or you can? That's fine. I mean, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So I think, like I said, my earliest leaders, and I'm sure there are some before that, but go back at least to the 14th century of African women in public space, demonstrating leadership. In my own country, in Cameroon, the first group of people to carry out a nonviolent protest march against the colonizer were market women in Douala. There is a group of women called Anlu. So the other thing to realize is that in most of our African societies, women have had their own organizations apart. And, we looked at that and thought, oh, what a horrible thing. Not necessarily. Because a lot of strategy, a lot of thinking, a lot of feminism was going on in those organizations and deciding how do we negotiate with the superpower structure. And my reading of history is that as far as our rights as women go, before colonialism, we had a little bit of patriarchy, little bit, but we had very clear and distinct spheres of power that remain in our traditions till today. There's so many traditions that you can only do from the woman's side. Okay, so we have distinct. When we encountered colonialism, Christianity, and Islam. And we move from here to here. And so today, as feminists, we're trying to bring it back. So we were not in egalitarian societies, but the gap was much, much smaller than it is today. But we're definitely fighting it. We're there.
I like to speak a little bit as a man.
I don't.
We're going to allow that.
I think feminism it's a bit like Pan-Africanism. in a way that often it's not clear what is being discussed, right? Different people see feminism in different ways. So, and I'm not sure, there's certainly movement, but it's also as a construct. It's a Western construct that is being juxtaposed. Hang on. I remember going to Norway as a young student. So I arrived in Norway, and if you want to talk about women's rights, Norway is on the top of the index. So I asked my best friends in Norway, I said, tell me about this feminism thing, because I'm not sure what it is. He says, well, feminism, I say, no, I don't know. What is feminism? He said, look, women don't want to take their husbands' names. I'm like, okay, anything else? He said, they want to be paid the same amount as men. I'm like, okay, anything else? He said, well, some of them, they want us to change the pedestrian signs. They want a man, a woman, and a child crossing together. So my response to him was, oh, is that so? I thought you Norwegians were civilized. Mm-hmm. And the reason I said that, I'm Zairian, I'm Congolese. Mm-hmm. What the women are fighting for in DRC, at least when I was growing up, was not to change their names. Women in Zaire didn't take their husbands' names.
Their names, yeah.
So it was not part of the discourse. Mm-hmm. It's here. Fiancés beg their fiancés to take their names before they get married. They want to settle that, right? That's not part of the construct within Congolese society. Mm-hmm. You marry somebody, the ID says their marital status married to you, but their name remains Kawala. Mm-hmm. So she doesn't want to fight you over name. Mm-hmm. When you get the job, if you get the job, you qualify, you get paid the same thing. So this ceiling did not exist. What existed was access to certain jobs, which was a different course. So now there is this wide embrace of this big construct called feminism. And that's what I mean by it's not always clear what that means, what part of Africa you're coming from, what is your tradition. I come from a matrilineal family tradition. I trace my lineage to my mother, not through my father. In fact, a lot of men in where I'm from say, I need to marry a woman from somewhere else so the kids can belong to me. Right? That's how they justify taking a second wife. Because they say, these are your kids and your family. I need some kids for me. So I'm just saying, not to say that they don't exist or exist. The variation and gradation.
There's an
I'm not sure.
There's an African context.
Yeah, I think what we are the notion of equity between men and women is universal. There's no it's a Western concept about
but feminism is a different story.
And that's the only thing that feminism does.
I don't know.
Feminism is fighting for equity. Now that is expressed in different ways depending on the society in which you live. The inequality is expressed in different ways.
Madeleine Albright, a couple weeks ago, said, a woman doesn't support a woman, goes to hell. Right? Okay. And the young women were supporting Bernie Sanders. Where is the feminism in there?
No, but no, you can't reduce.
This is the world we live in.
Remember, we'll talk about women in combat roles in the Marine Corps in the next. Yeah, but let's take some more questions.
Good job, moderator.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Lila Percy, and actually my question is about the connection between economic development and women's reproductive health. Because when women are in control of when they have their children and where they have their children, they become healthier and they start their own businesses and they run for office. And so if you could talk about that, and actually I wanted to ask that question this morning because for some that seems to be such an unusual concept, but it's true in this country as well. If women are in control of when and where they have their children, they can improve their lives of their families as well as their communities. And a codicil to that is, I hope you are safe running for office. I would work for your campaign in a second. But I fear for women who speak truth to power that they will be safe in their country. So if you could sort of talk about women, economic development, reproductive health, how it's connected to agriculture.
Put it all together.
You got the whole
Get the whole
enchilada,
thing.
and you've got 10 minutes.
5.
So yeah, somebody asked me that question during the break, actually. So reproductive health is, so you're talking to the daughter. I told you about my women's line is tough. My mom ran the Planned Parenthood branch for Cameroon for many, many years. So reproductive health, unfortunately, like other health services, is most effective when it is provided by the state. That's when you can get it going to women on scale. And since we are not being effective at providing health services of any kind, we're not being so effective at providing reproductive health services. Now that said, depending on the country I know well in that domain is Cameroon. So a Cameroonian woman does not have a problem obtaining contraception. If she knows about it and if she wants it, she will be able to get it, unless she lives in a fairly remote rural area where there will again be the problem of access to health services in general. So there's not a big problem of access to reproductive health, or that problem is not greater than the problem of access to health services in general. However, there are cultural elements where we still, as Africans, Jimmy was referring to it, and it's not only culture, it's our background, is that because we've not had access to health services, you had a lot of babies because it was understood that some of them were going to die, right? So that is still within us. So having babies is very important in Africa. You can get away with not getting married, but have a baby. It's like, we also like marriage very much, but if you are going to be extreme, you can get away with not getting married, but have a baby. So reproduction is still very, very important for us, and these are some of the things we have to deal with in an educational system for young girls from the time that they are young, for them to realize what effect that has on their lives, to understand that they don't need to have so many babies because they're not necessarily going to die and so on. But in spite of that, women, as I explained, are in the economy. The difficulty that we have is how do we move them from survival level up the economic ladder. And that means them a whole series of things: information, training, access to finance, etc., access to land. There, if you talk about one issue, one feminist issue, that would change the lives of African women almost throughout the continent, is if they could own their own land. For most of Africa, women work the land, but they do not own it.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah. We're almost out of town. One more question back there, and then, yes.
My name is Fatima Conte, and I'm a student from the University of Maine. And the top leading hospitals and healthcare systems are often found in the Western world. And from personal experience, I've seen that if provided the opportunity, that individuals in my country will seek a second opinion or treatment in the West. And what do you think that certain regions of Africa's healthcare system are missing? And why don't we have more hospitals or research institutions that can compete with Harvard or Johns Hopkins yet?
All right.
Health. Let's start with Jimmy. Do you want to talk?
If you fail to pay your taxes someone will knock on your door and say, you didn't pay your taxes. When you pay your taxes, the government says, or the mayor says, these are the services for which we are going to budget and put your money there, then you'll be able to see, monitor, and determine the extent to which your money has been used effectively and efficiently. Because you have a voice. You can raise hell, basically. Over there, you don't have that voice. We said, and this morning, all the speakers said, you have someone sitting there for 25 years, 30 years, 32 years,
30.
and he's saying, I'm the best. And you look for, and the statistics are very compelling. For 100,000, you have one doctor, and you have maybe 2 sanitary districts. All right? So you have to travel 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, bad roads, bad then. Until we get through the basic and fundamental, we're not going to be able to compare it to the Harvards and to the others. Our issue is bad governance, malgovernance. People do not have an opportunity to say, where did my money go? Period. Until we get to that point, and luckily, and she talked about Burkina, and I'm in Burkina. And now the dynamics are very clear, game-changing strategies. The people are sitting there and say, okay, Minister of Health, how much is your budget? And what are you going to do with your budget? This and this big lines. People will be able to see and say, oh, over there we're lacking this, over there we're lacking this, and by the way, we need a research institute in this area and that area. And you see the magnificence of what is going to take place, what is going to happen. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think they're going to be going a long way toward what you're trying to ask us now. Until then, a few countries are trying, the rest of them are in the dumps. And we just need to clean them up very quickly.
Well, on that note,
Can I add quickly?
of course.
So one thing I want to say, Fatima, is that the medical sector is another area where there's room for collaboration between African countries. You know, in Africa, we talk Pan-Africanism, we talk about the next goal. We're very bad at collaboration, right? So you look at a country like the DRC, it looks messy. But the DRC is a top doctor-producing country in the region. You know, you don't think about it that way, but they produce a lot of doctors. A lot of doctors in Rwanda are Congolese, in Burundi, an entire region. Botswana, which is considered a success story, 51% of doctors in Botswana are Congolese. That's how high the level is. So that tells us something. Is there room for collaboration now? This is just for that region. I don't know how it is in West Africa. But is there room for collaboration here? Obviously, somebody has the skills, and it's proven, and somebody is still struggling to build medical school. So where's the comparative advantage? Where's the competitive advantage? And we're not doing that. There's no synergy. We are fighting, saying those guys are useless, they're incompetent, we are incompetent. But you cannot be competent across the board, as we see in the case of Botswana. For some reason, Botswana has not been able to train a lot of good doctors for themselves. So just food for thought.
Thank you very much. I think we have to leave it at that. We're out of time. Thank you.